For Canada's Indigenous people, it's another tragic but not unexpected moment. Less than a month after the remains of 215 children were found in British Columbia, another unmarked mass grave at another Catholic residential school, uncovered in Saskatchewan province. This one 3 times bigger than the last.
We started our radar penetrating research on June the 2nd of 2021. As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves.
One survivor said Indigenous people were labeled heathens by the Catholic Church, and nuns told the children they didn't have souls.
I'm 80 years old, and I went to boarding school down there. I was taken by my parents to go. At that time, if the parents didn't want to allow their children to go to boarding school, one of them had to go to jail. So in order that we keep the family together, we went to boarding school. They brought us there, we stayed there.
First Nations leaders in Canada are now demanding the Pope apologize for atrocities committed against them in the name of the Catholic Church and help them identify their dead. Countrywide protests, vandalized churches, calls by activists to cancel Canada Day, all part of the fallout. Earlier this week at the United Nations, China, itself often under the spotlight for human rights violations, criticized Canada.
Over 150,000 Indigenous children in Canada were reported to have been forcibly taken away from their parents. At least 4,000 children died of disease, neglect, accidents, or abuse while at school. We call for a thorough and impartial investigation into all cases where crimes were committed against the Indigenous people, especially the children.
International condemnation that prompted an angry response from Canada's Prime Minister.
In Canada, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Where is China's Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Where is their truth? Where is the openness that Canada has always shown and the responsibility that Canada has taken for the terrible mistakes of the past and indeed many of which continue into the present?
Indigenous leaders say school deaths were underreported, and the actual number of children in unmarked graves across Canada could be in the tens of thousands. They want to find them all. But even if they do, poor record-keeping means bodies may never be identified. So the families who still remember the children who went to school and never came home may never have closure. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera.
Paula Palmater is a member of the Eel River Bar First Nation. She's also professor and chair of the Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. She's joining us now from Toronto. Thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has said that Canada must acknowledge the truth of the systemic racism, discrimination and injustices that Indigenous people have faced. Are Canadians willing to face up to this grim aspect of their history?
Well, I think Canadians have shown an inclination more so than Prime Minister Trudeau or the federal government. Keep in mind, while he's saying we need to address these problems from the past, he's fighting residential school survivors in court. He's not turning over documents related to the deaths and abuse in those residential schools. He's fighting First Nation kids in foster care in court, many of whom were in foster care because of the intergenerational trauma from residential schools. So the words and the actions don't really match up, but Canadians have really stepped up and have tried to put pressure on governments to take immediate action.
Is there any indication that that pressure is working? From what you're saying, it looks as though the government is fairly intransigent in terms of the action that it's prepared to take on this.
Well, exactly. And it's also trying to historicize what happened. So, you know, all of these unmarked graves are happening in the here and now. First Nations have been asking for generations for both churches and all levels of government to come forth, share all their records, identify the graves, and provide the resources to return these children home. And they have refused, even after our Truth and Reconciliation Commission said there needs to be a full investigation into all of these unmarked graves where First Nations knew exactly where they were. Canada refused to step up. It's only now, because the truth is being exposed by First Nations themselves and Canadians expressing outrage that this hasn't been addressed before now, that I think that will spur governments to act fairly quickly, more so than had Canadians not been shown this information.
What would be the most appropriate ways for Canada and the Canadian government to acknowledge this part of history?
Well, they have to step up and accept moral, political, and legal responsibility for what happened. These weren't mistakes. These were crimes. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls said these were crimes of genocide, historic and ongoing. There's lawyers who have written to the United Nations saying, listen, these are at minimum crimes against humanity. And we know that under Canada's criminal code, all of the murders, manslaughter, medical experimentation, torture, sexual and physical abuse that happened, these are all crimes. And so Canada needs to step up before the world and say, we are guilty of these crimes, historic and ongoing, and here's what we're going to do to end it in the present and make reparations for what we did in the past. Both parts have to go together.
What are the chances, do you think, that given the numbers that we've seen today, given the numbers of children that we saw found in British Columbia, 215, I believe it was, what are the chances we're going to see more discoveries like this and that might reach a tipping point?
Well, I think it's guaranteed we will. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a whole section on all of these unmarked graves. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has called for an investigation into the actual numbers because of the refusal of churches, federal and provincial governments to hand over documents so that we could count for these children. And so we know there's only been a handful now of First Nations who've been able to find hundreds of unmarked graves. And we know that there was at least 150 residential schools, and then there's Indian day schools, and then there's the Indian hospitals and all of the other institutions that are associated, which have the deaths of thousands and thousands of Indigenous children, and they have yet to be accounted for. So I think as the numbers increase, this is really going to be a day of reckoning for Canada.
Pamela Palmerton, we really appreciate you joining us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed for your time, ma'am.
Thank you.